Maria Johnson walked through the quiet streets of Washington, D.C., before sunrise, her footsteps soft but steady as she carried a worn leather notebook filled with ideas that she believed could change lives, and though the world around her still slept, her mind was alive with purpose because for years people had overlooked her, doubted her, or spoken over her, but Maria had learned that silence could be powerful when it was chosen, not when it was forced, and this morning she carried that quiet power like a shield, remembering every small moment that had brought her here, from childhood days in Chicago when she sat on her grandmother's porch listening to stories of resilience and fairness, to the long evenings in college when she worked 2 jobs to pay tuition and still found time to volunteer at community centers where she saw firsthand how families struggled to find justice in systems built to ignore them, and each memory sharpened her resolve because she understood that justice was not an abstract word in a textbook but a living promise that people deserved to feel in their daily lives, and she had spent years building skills to protect that promise, earning a law degree while balancing the constant weight of expectations and the quiet sting of those who underestimated her simply because she spoke softly and carried herself with calm confidence, and yet those very qualities made her persuasive, because when she spoke, people listened, not out of fear but out of respect, and now as she approached the old stone courthouse where she would meet a group of reform advocates, she felt the chilly morning air wrap around her like a silent challenge, reminding her that real change was never comfortable, never easy, and rarely immediate, and she thought back to her first case as a young attorney when a small business owner had nearly lost everything to an unfair policy until Maria, with careful research and a steady voice, convinced the court to reverse the decision, a victory that taught her that patience and preparation were stronger than any loud display, and it was this lesson she carried into every meeting, every conversation with lawmakers, every late-night drafting of proposals that sought to bring fairness to people who felt invisible, and though she faced obstacles, political resistance, endless paperwork, and the quiet prejudice of those who dismissed her because of her background, she remained undeterred, drawing strength from her grandmother's wisdom that true justice required both courage and grace, and as the courthouse steps came into view she noticed the first light of dawn spilling across the sky, painting it with soft streaks of gold and rose, and she paused for a moment, breathing in the cool morning air, letting the sight remind her that even the darkest night gives way to light, and inside the building a handful of advocates were already gathering, men and women of different ages and experiences who shared a common belief that fairness belonged to everyone, and as Maria entered the room their conversations quieted, not because of any title she held though she was now widely known among reform circles as a leading voice but because her presence carried a calm authority born of years of consistent action, and she greeted each person warmly, remembering names, asking about families, and listening intently to their updates on community cases, for Maria believed that leadership was not about commanding attention but about understanding people, and as the meeting began she opened her notebook and spoke with measured confidence about new proposals aimed at protecting vulnerable communities, outlining steps to secure bipartisan support and practical funding, and the room grew animated as ideas flowed, yet Maria never raised her voice, instead guiding the discussion with patient questions and thoughtful insights until plans began to take shape, and while others debated strategy she quietly wrote down key points, knowing that real progress would come not from grand speeches but from persistent effort, and as the morning stretched on she felt a deep sense of purpose, aware that every small decision they made today could ripple outward to touch countless lives, and though the road ahead would demand long nights and unwavering focus, Maria welcomed the challenge because she understood that justice was not a single event but a continuous journey, and when the meeting ended and the advocates left to begin their day, Maria remained behind for a moment, looking out the tall courthouse window at the brightening city beyond, reflecting on how far she had come and how much work remained, and she thought of the people who once doubted her, who had laughed or dismissed her efforts, and she felt no bitterness, only a quiet determination to prove through action what words could never fully capture, for she believed that the best response to doubt was undeniable progress, and with that thought she closed her notebook, slipped it back into her bag, and stepped into the sunlight, ready to continue the long but rewarding path toward a fairer society where every voice mattered and justice was more than an ideal, it was a reality built step by step through courage, persistence, and the quiet strength she carried within her every single day. The next morning Maria Johnson woke before her alarm, the faint hum of the city drifting through her apartment window as she prepared for a day that would test both her patience and her skill. And as she brewed a pot of strong coffee she reviewed the notes she had written the night before, lines of careful handwriting that mapped out her strategy for a public forum where community members and city leaders would gather to discuss long-delayed reforms. And though Maria had stood in front of countless audiences, she felt the familiar flutter of nerves because she knew that real conversations about fairness often carried hidden tension. Yet she welcomed the challenge because she believed that genuine dialogue required both courage and calm, and after dressing in a simple navy suit she walked through the bustling streets, greeting shop owners who were opening their doors, pausing to smile at a young boy chalking bright shapes on the sidewalk, small moments of connection that reminded her why she worked so hard, for she believed justice was built not only in courtrooms or offices but also in everyday kindness and respect. And as she approached the community center she saw volunteers setting up rows of chairs while the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery floated in the warm morning air, a gentle reminder that life held simple joys even in the midst of serious debate. And when Maria stepped inside the wide hall she found a mix of city officials, teachers, students, and neighborhood elders already gathering, their conversations forming a low steady buzz that echoed off the wooden floor, and she greeted each group with the same genuine interest she always carried, listening to concerns about housing costs, school funding, and small business struggles, taking mental notes of every story because she believed that statistics meant little without the human experiences behind them. And when the forum began she stood at the front with a quiet confidence, thanking everyone for coming and explaining in plain words the proposals her team had crafted, carefully outlining how fair policing practices, transparent budgeting, and equal access to legal aid could strengthen the entire community. And as she spoke she noticed how people leaned forward, drawn not by dramatic gestures but by the steady conviction in her voice. And when questions began they came fast, some supportive, some skeptical, but Maria responded with patience, acknowledging every worry and clarifying every detail, never dismissing even the harshest doubts because she believed respect was the first step toward trust. And as the discussion deepened an older teacher named Linda shared a story about students who felt unheard when reporting safety concerns, her voice carrying both weariness and hope. And Maria listened intently, promising to include those students in future planning sessions, a pledge that brought quiet nods from several parents in the room. And when a young shop owner raised concerns about small business permits Maria offered to meet later to review specific paperwork, knowing that small practical help often opened the door to larger change. And the forum lasted well past noon, the sunlight shifting across the tall windows as conversations continued in clusters even after the official agenda ended. And when the crowd finally began to disperse Maria stayed to speak with those who lingered, shaking hands, exchanging contact information, and thanking each person for sharing their voice, because she believed that every meeting was only as strong as the relationships it built. And as the last chairs were stacked she walked outside into the golden afternoon light, her notebook now filled with fresh ideas and promises to follow up. And though she felt the pleasant fatigue of long focus she also carried a rising sense of purpose, knowing that today had strengthened the fragile bridge between officials and citizens, a bridge she had spent years helping to build. And on her way home she stopped at a quiet park where children played under tall oak trees, taking a seat on a bench to breathe in the late day calm. And she thought of her grandmother again, recalling the gentle words that had guided her since childhood. Justice is patience in motion, and she smiled at how those simple words still rang true, because she understood that real progress was not a single victory but a continuous unfolding, like the slow turning of seasons. And as the evening deepened, she received a message from a respected senator who had attended the forum in silence, thanking her for her clarity and inviting her to discuss potential national policy changes in the coming weeks. And Maria read the note with quiet satisfaction, not because it flattered her but because it meant that the voices she had amplified today were beginning to reach higher levels of decision-making, which was always her goal. And later that night she returned to her apartment, kicked off her shoes, and opened her notebook again, carefully writing down every commitment she had made so she could keep each one, for she knew that trust was earned through follow-through, not speeches. And as the city lights twinkled outside her window, she reflected on the day, feeling gratitude for the people who had shared their stories, for the volunteers who had set up chairs and brewed coffee, for the quiet strength of neighbors who believed that fairness was worth the effort. And though she was tired, her spirit felt light because she could sense the slow but steady movement towards something better, a movement powered not by any single leader but by countless ordinary people choosing to care. And as midnight approached, Maria finally set down her pen, whispering a small promise to herself that she would continue to carry their hopes into every meeting and every plan. And with that thought she drifted to sleep, ready to wake and continue the long, patient work of making justice real for everyone. Maria Johnson woke to a soft rain tapping against her window, the gentle rhythm blending with the low hum of early morning traffic, and as she stretched she felt a calm determination settle over her because today would bring new challenges and opportunities, and she knew that every step she took mattered to the people who trusted her to speak on their behalf. So after a quick breakfast she gathered her notes and a slim laptop before heading to the train station, where commuters shuffled in. Quiet lines beneath umbrellas, the gray sky casting a silver glow on the wet pavement, and during the short ride to the Capital District she reviewed messages from community leaders who had attended the forum, each note filled with gratitude, questions, and practical suggestions, which she carefully marked for follow-up because she believed that small acts of listening created the foundation for larger agreements. And when she arrived at her office she found her assistant already sorting through stacks of documents related to upcoming hearings, a reminder of how complex the work of reform could be. Yet Maria greeted the day with a warm smile and steady energy, offering thanks for the dedication of her team, because she never forgot that leadership was a shared effort, not a solitary climb. And soon she was seated across from a group of city planners and legal advisors who had requested her input on a pilot project to make housing more accessible, a subject close to her heart. Since she had watched friends and neighbors struggle with rising costs back in Chicago, and as the meeting began she listened with full attention, asking precise questions and taking detailed notes, offering ideas that balanced fairness with practical budgeting. And though some participants doubted that such a project could gain political support, Maria responded with quiet clarity, outlining step by step how similar efforts in other states had succeeded when guided by patient negotiation and strong community involvement. And by the end of the session the planners nodded thoughtfully, agreeing to draft a proposal based on her recommendations, a small but meaningful victory that strengthened her belief that persistence often accomplished more than loud demands. And as she left the conference room she received a call from Senator Reid's office confirming a meeting later that afternoon to discuss national legislation aimed at improving access to legal aid, an invitation that filled her with a quiet sense of responsibility because she knew this conversation could open doors for countless families. And on her way to the Capitol she paused at a small cafe where the scent of fresh coffee and warm bread mingled with the earthy smell of rain, and while she sipped a cup of dark roast she noticed a young woman at the next table reading a thick law textbook with tired eyes, and Maria felt a wave of recognition, remembering her own long nights of study, so she offered an encouraging smile and a brief conversation that left the student visibly heartened, a moment that reminded Maria how mentorship often happened in the simplest exchanges, and soon she was walking through the grand marble halls of the Capitol, her footsteps echoing softly as she was greeted by aides and staffers who had heard of her work, and when she entered Senator Reed's office she was met with a warm handshake and an attentive gaze, the senator inviting her to share her insights on how to create fair access to legal help for low-income communities, and Maria spoke with her characteristic calm, presenting clear examples from the neighborhoods she served, showing how early legal support prevented crises and saved public resources, and as the conversation deepened she sensed genuine interest, the senator asking thoughtful questions and taking notes, and by the end of the hour they agreed to collaborate on a pilot bill that could bring measurable change within a year, a commitment that filled Maria with cautious optimism because she understood that legislation required patience but also vision, and as she stepped back into the rain-washed afternoon she felt both humbled and energized, aware that the voices of countless families now had a chance to reach the highest levels of government, and while walking toward the train station she received a message from her grandmother, a simple text that read "Proud of you," and those 3 words warmed her heart more than any official recognition ever could, for they reminded her why she had chosen this path in the first place, and later, as evening settled over the city, Maria attended a neighborhood gathering at a local library where parents, teachers, and students discussed the importance of civic participation, and though she had already spent hours in meetings she listened with the same attention as she had that morning, answering questions with patience, encouraging young people to stay curious and involved, and when a quiet high school senior approached her afterward to say he wanted to study law because of her example, Maria felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that each inspired voice added strength to the movement for fairness, and when she finally returned home that night the rain had eased, leaving the streets glistening under soft streetlights, and she paused for a moment outside her building to breathe in the cool, clean air, reflecting on a day filled with countless small steps that together moved the cause of justice forward, and she knew that tomorrow would bring new hurdles, new debates, and perhaps new doubts from those who underestimated her calm approach, but she welcomed them all because she understood that lasting change came from steady hands and steadfast hearts, and as she climbed the stairs to her apartment she felt a quiet joy, aware that the laughter of doubters and the noise of critics could never outweigh the growing chorus of people who believed, as she did, that justice was not a dream but a daily practice, shaped by every thoughtful conversation, every careful plan, and every moment of human connection that honored the dignity of all. The morning sun slipped through a thin veil of clouds as Maria Johnson stepped onto the balcony of her apartment, the city below already alive with the sounds of traffic, footsteps, and distant conversations, and she felt a quiet anticipation because today she would present the first draft of a national bill that could reshape access to legal aid, a milestone she had worked toward for years, and as she sipped warm tea she reflected on how every small step, late-night research sessions, countless community meetings, careful listening to stories of struggle had led to this moment, and after a quick breakfast she reviewed her notes once more, ensuring that every statistic and example was clear and truthful, because she believed honesty was the foundation of trust, and then she dressed in a charcoal suit and set out for the Capitol where Senator Reed and other lawmakers awaited her insights, the streets glistening from last night's gentle rain, the scent of fresh earth and blooming trees, carrying a promise of renewal, and during the short walk from the train station she greeted familiar faces, vendors setting up fruit stands, a bus driver who waved with a cheerful grin, a group of school children laughing on their way to class, small reminders of the people whose lives she hoped to impact, and as she entered the grand marble halls she felt the familiar mixture of humility and resolve, aware that her work represented not only her own vision but also the hopes of those countless neighbors, teachers, and families who had shared their stories with her, and when she reached the meeting room she found senators and policy advisors gathered around a long wooden table, their conversations pausing as she entered, and she offered a warm greeting before distributing copies of her proposal, explaining in steady, simple language how the plan would provide fair legal support for those who could not afford it, reduce unnecessary court backlogs, and strengthen communities by preventing small disputes from becoming crises. And though some lawmakers raised concerns about budget limits, Maria responded with calm clarity, showing how careful funding and phased implementation could make the program both effective and sustainable. And as the discussion continued, she noticed several skeptical expressions begin to soften as they considered her data and the real-life stories she shared, such as the single mother who avoided eviction because a volunteer attorney helped her understand her rights, or the small shop owner who kept his business after receiving early legal guidance. And when the meeting ended after nearly 2 hours, the room was filled with quiet agreement to move the draft forward for further review, a significant step that filled Maria with a deep, measured satisfaction. And as she left the building, her phone buzzed with messages from her team who had followed the session through live updates, their excitement matching her own quiet joy. Yet she reminded them in her reply that patience and steady effort would still be needed, because she knew the path from proposal to law was long and often unpredictable. And later that afternoon she attended a community celebration at a public park where volunteers planted young trees as a symbol of growth and renewal, and she joined them, kneeling in the soft soil to help place a sapling in the ground, feeling the earth cool against her hands and thinking how justice, like a tree, required strong roots and steady care. And after the planting she spoke briefly to the gathered crowd, thanking them for their dedication and reminding them that every action, big or small, contributed to a fairer society. And as she looked across the faces of children, parents, elders, and students, she felt a quiet swell of pride, knowing that the movement for fairness belonged to everyone, not just those in offices or courtrooms. And when evening approached she walked home beneath a sky brushed with soft pink and gold, her mind both tired and alive with ideas. And upon reaching her apartment she opened her window to let in the warm spring air while she updated her notebook, carefully recording the day's progress and the names of people who needed follow-up calls, because she believed promises mattered only when kept. And later she sat in a comfortable chair with a cup of herbal tea, reflecting on how far her journey had carried her, remembering the early days when some people laughed at her calm approach or doubted that a quiet voice could bring real change. And she felt no bitterness toward those memories, only gratitude for the strength they had unknowingly helped her build, because their doubt had sharpened her resolve to prove through action that steady hearts could move mountains. And as the city lights flickered on outside she received a message from her grandmother once again, a simple blessing for courage and rest. And Maria smiled, her heart warmed by the thought that even the strongest leaders drew strength from the quiet love of family. And before bedtime she stood at her window watching the stars emerge one by one, letting the cool night air settle her mind, and she whispered a silent promise to continue the work with patience and grace, knowing that the road ahead would bring both triumphs and setbacks, yet trusting that each day of honest effort carried the movement a little closer to the vision she held so dearly, a nation where justice was not a distant ideal, but a living reality for everyone. Morning light filtered softly through the curtains of Maria Johnson's apartment as she rose with a quiet sense of anticipation, because today she would stand before both national leaders and community representatives to witness the final vote on the bill she had nurtured from an idea into a detailed proposal. And while she prepared a simple breakfast she reflected on the long path that had brought her here, from the first community meeting where a handful of neighbors shared their struggles to the countless late nights filled with research, patient conversations, and careful planning that had shaped every clause of the legislation. And she knew that whatever the outcome, the journey itself had already strengthened the bonds between citizens and lawmakers, teaching everyone involved that persistent collaboration could overcome skepticism. and after dressing in a navy suit she walked through the waking city, noticing the smell of fresh bread from a corner bakery and the cheerful greetings of shopkeepers who had followed her progress with pride, their encouraging words reminding her that this moment belonged to many, not just to her. And when she arrived at the Grand Capitol building she paused for a breath, letting the cool morning air steady her heart before stepping inside, where marble floors echoed with the footsteps of aides, reporters, and officials. And as she entered the gallery she was greeted by Senator Reid with a warm handshake and a quiet smile that conveyed both respect and hope, and soon the chamber filled with lawmakers, staff, and community members who had traveled from across the country to witness the vote, their conversations a soft murmur that carried a sense of history. And when the session began Maria sat among her team, her notebook in hand, listening as the bill was formally introduced, each word representing months of shared effort and countless voices of ordinary people who had refused to be ignored. And as senators debated the details she remained calm, her eyes steady as she silently repeated the advice her grandmother once gave her to trust the work and let patience guide the rest. And when the time for the vote finally arrived the chamber grew hushed, the quiet so complete that even the faint rustle of paper sounded loud, and one by one the senators cast their decisions, the clerk's voice echoing each response. And though Maria kept her expression composed her heart quickened with each yes, and when the final tally revealed that the bill had passed with strong support a gentle wave of applause filled the room, not thunderous but warm and genuine, and Maria felt a deep, almost overwhelming gratitude, not only for the victory itself but for the journey of trust and cooperation that had made it possible. And as she rose to her feet she exchanged smiles and handshakes with her team, their quiet joy reflecting her own, because they all understood that this moment belonged to the countless people whose stories had shaped the legislation, from parents worried about their children's safety to small business owners seeking fairness. And later, during a brief press gathering, Maria spoke with her characteristic calm, thanking every community member, volunteer, and lawmaker who had contributed, emphasizing that true justice came from listening and working together. And her words carried through the cameras and microphones to homes across the nation, where families who had once felt unseen now felt a new sense of possibility. And after the interviews she stepped outside into the bright midday sun, where a gentle breeze carried the scent of spring flowers from the Capitol gardens, and she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of light on her face, letting the simple joy of the moment settle deep inside her. And that evening she attended a community gathering at the very center where her early forums had taken place, greeted by familiar faces and new friends alike, the room filled with laughter, music, and quiet conversation as neighbors celebrated not just a law but the belief that their voices mattered. And when Maria stood to speak she kept her message simple, reminding everyone that this achievement was only the beginning and that the real work of justice continued every day in homes, schools, and workplaces. And as she looked across the room she saw young students with notebooks of their own, eager to ask questions and share ideas, and she felt a powerful sense of hope knowing that the next generation would carry the movement forward. And as the evening stretched into night she walked through the neighborhood where the soft glow of streetlights reflected off the pavement still damp from an afternoon shower, and she thought of her grandmother waiting for her call, of the early mornings and quiet sacrifices, of the people who had once doubted her calm approach and of how their skepticism had only strengthened her resolve. And she realized that true victory was not about proving anyone wrong but about proving that steady hearts could indeed bring lasting change. And when she finally reached home she opened her window to the cool night air, hearing distant music and the gentle rustle of leaves, and she sat at her desk to write the final entry in the notebook that had traveled with her from the first idea to this historic day, recording every promise kept and every lesson learned. And as she placed the pen down she felt a deep peace settle over her, a quiet certainty that the movement for fairness would continue to grow beyond her own efforts, because it now lived in the hearts of countless people who had found their voices and their courage. and before turning out the light she whispered a simple thanks to all who had walked beside her: family, friends, neighbors, and even strangers who believed in justice. And with that she rested, content in the knowledge that the work of building a fairer society would go on, step by step, powered by patience, compassion, and the unshakable belief that every person deserved to be heard and treated with dignity.